The first baby blanket I ever tried to knit was a complete and total disaster. And I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen to you too. This baby blanket is incredibly easy to knit. It's super beginner friendly, but it doesn't look like a beginner blanket, if you know what I mean. The colors work together really beautiful. It keeps it fun and interesting to knit. Plus, you use 2 strands at once, so you can knit it up in basically half the time. Now, this isn't a brand new pattern. It's actually been available on my website for a few years, but I wanted to update this video because the yarn that I originally designed the blanket for, well, it's no longer available. You can snag it up occasionally here and there, but to my knowledge, it's not readily available to purchase. The yarn that I found that is the closest substitute is Super Saver brushed. This yarn feels very similar to Dreamy. It has the same really pretty fluffy halo, and it has a really great palette of color options. There's lots of pastels, so I think it's still really great for a baby blanket. Very affordable as well, so that's always a big plus. You'll also need a US 15 knitting needle for this project. It's best if you use circular needles. Something that's at least 36 inches long will get the job done. That was actually the big mistake that I made with my first baby blanket. I thought I could knit the blanket on a pair of 12-inch straight needles. And I found out the hard way that all of the stitches have to be on the needles at the same time. And so if you're knitting a 12-inch blanket, then yeah, you're good to go. But if you want to knit a blanket that's a little bit wider, you do need some circulars for that.
We'll be using the long tail cast on for this, so we need to estimate a long tail. Because we have to cast on a lot of stitches, we want to make sure we have enough yarn. So grab your needle and then just take your 2 ends, and we're going to wrap it around there a few times. This is just the estimating process. So I'm just wrapping, that's 2 wraps, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. I like to do a nice round number. Pinch that off with your finger back here, and you can let it go. And this is roughly the amount of yarn that it'll take to make 10 stitches. So then you'll take this tail and you'll fold it over. That'll be enough for 20 stitches. Fold it over again, and so on. All right, so you'll take the yarn right at the end here. This is my working yarn over here coming from my ball of yarn. This is the tail. Once again, your tail is going to be much longer because you're casting on 82 stitches. I'll be casting on 12 for my little swatch here. So I'll lay that over my needle. I'm opting to not use a slip knot for this. Then I want to gather it in my fingers. So put your 2 fingers together just like this and stick that between the 2 strands. Grab your fingers here in the background and pinch that off. Now open your 2 fingers and steady that on top of your needle. And then we're going to swing it down. Grab the strand on the front of your thumb. Swing it back. Grab the strand on your finger, and then release that thumb loop over the tip of the needle. Then you should be able to just pull on that, tighten it up, and that's 2 stitches cast on. I'll say that one more time. Wrap it around, grab the front strand on your thumb, wrap it back, grab the strand on your finger, then release your thumb over the tip of the needle. I'll also link to a video where I have the long tail cast on in complete beginner format. It's super slow. If you need some practice with this, then you can check that video linked in the description, and I'll also have it on your screen here. Now keep in mind that 2 strands corresponds with 1 stitch for this pattern. So when you're counting your cast on stitches, you're doing it in groups of 2 technically. So this is 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now once you have all your stitches cast on your needle, and keep in mind you're going to have some that's flowing into your cord here. That's why it's a good idea to have that 36-inch cord. I'm using the slightly smaller one because I've just got a swatch here. So you'll have a lot more stitches on your needle. When you have 82, we're ready to start on the first row. Now the stitch pattern is incredibly easy for this particular pattern. We're only going to work with knit stitches. So when you get to this point here, we just want to turn our work. So I'm going to take it and just flip it. Now you can see my tail end really clear here. I've just got a little bit left, just a couple of inches. So this is my working strand. That's really important because when you estimate, if you overestimate and you have a long tail and you don't keep track of that and you start knitting with your tail, well, you'll run into all kinds of problems when you come back around and realize that you've done that. So you want to make sure you're not knitting with your tail, and I'll just slide these stitches down to the end, and I'm ready to start knitting. Now when you work a knit stitch, you're simply going to take the tip of your other needle, stick it into the stitch from front to back. So this is what it'll look like from the front, and when you flip it over, it'll look like that. So I'm holding that needle there with my finger. So I just want to take that working yarn, wrap it around the tip of my needle, and knit it off. Now what we can do from this point is grab your tail, give that a little pull, and that'll tighten up that stitch. Now I want to show you the knit stitch again using my dominant hand here. There's two ways of knitting. This is the way that I like to knit, but if you're a crocheter, you might find the other method a little more comfortable for you. So let's work with this dominant hand for a few more stitches. I'll find my next stitch, once again keeping in mind that it is 2 strands of yarn. Insert my needle knitwise. I'll take the yarn, wrap it around the tip, and knit it off. By the way, this is sometimes called flick knitting, and I was a crocheter first. I knitted in the continental style for a little while before I settled in on this one. It's really comfortable for me. So that's flick knitting. Let's look at this other option. Now I'm going to drop it from my dominant hand, pick it up in my non-dominant hand the same way that I would hold my yarn as if I were crocheting. So I've sort of got it wrapped around my pinky there, under these 2 fingers, and over my index finger here. I'll find my next stitch. Now I'll still insert my needle in the same way, but the motion feels a little different. Watch where the working yarn is coming there from the back side of that needle. I'll stick my needle in the stitch just like before, and then I just simply want to grab that from the back there and pull it through. Then slide everything down, work that again. It's going to be a little tighter here on this first row because our cast on stitches are not as stretchy as our traditional stitch. So as we work up a few more rows, this technique will get a lot more comfortable. You can see things are a little tight. I'm having to sort of push them down. That's okay. That's totally normal. So that is the continental style of knitting. Whichever you prefer, they actually look the same no matter what. So I'm going to go back here to my comfortable style of knitting and finish knitting the rest of the stitches in my swatch. Now for you, you'll go ahead and knit every single one of your cast on stitches until you get to the very end. Okay, so once you get to the end of your row, your work should look something like this, only of course quite a bit longer. So we're ready to start on row 2. We're not changing anything with the stitch pattern, but what you'll need to do is turn your work once again. So I'm just flipping it in this direction, taking my needle along for the ride, and I'm ready to start knitting once again. So the first thing I always do is get my stitches situated. They're a little tight, like I mentioned, because we've got that first row, so no worries there. I'll find my first stitch, get my needle into position, gather up my yarn to knit the first stitch. And I'll continue knitting until I get to the end of the row. No changes here, just knitting.
So the result of knitting every single stitch for every single row gives you a stitch pattern called the garter stitch. This is one of the signature stitches in knitting, and you've probably seen it many times before. It gives you that characteristic bumpy, sort of wavy texture. It's really squishy and really stretchy and very warm, making it great for your baby blanket.
So here we have an overview of what the color pattern looks like for our baby blanket. Now keep in mind that this is sort of a side view, and although I've been knitting with the gray, 2 strands of gray for my swatch, so it's easier for you to see on camera, we actually start at this edge right here. So that is our cast on edge, and we work in this direction. You'll notice here that we have 5 different stripes, and when we break it down to give it a name, this is what it looks like. So we have A, B, C, and C. So you'll use this reference in order to guide what 2 strands you hold together. So for example, this would be your first strand, this would be your second strand, and so on. Okay, so the next thing you need to know is how long do you work each of these stripes? Well, because we want things to be nice and uniform, we're going to work each stripe for about 7 inches. So from one side to the next is going to be 7 inches. And that'll be the same for each one of our stripes. Okay, so now that you get the hang of that color pattern, let's talk about how to physically make that transition from our 2 color, which is what we've started with here, to where we have to add in that second color. So the first thing you'll need to do is find your working yarn, and you're going to trim one of them. Now leave yourself a tail that's about 8 inches or so. That'll give you enough to weave in later. I'll trim one and just completely let that one go. Then I've got my second yarn here. I'm going to have that here in the background, just ready to go, and I'll pretend as if I'm going to continue knitting. So holding my work this way is where I would have ended. Then I'm going to flip it and get ready to knit. So insert your needle knitwise just as you normally would. I've got my 2 ends here, so tail right here. I'll tuck that behind, and then this is my good piece of yarn. So grab your second color and then fold it in half, leaving yourself a tail that's about 8 inches, and then just place that over the tip of that needle. Then also take that strand from that previous color and wrap it around. Now I'm holding all of this in my pinky just so I can get it through that stitch. So I'm pulling through one of each color and knitting it as normal. And I've got that first stitch. We're pretty much ready to go now, but we do have some loose ends that we need to get tidied up so that we don't drop our stitches completely. So to fix that, we'll just take the 2 ends from each color, just make a knot with these, just to secure things for now. And we'll weave them in later. So moving forward, I'll go ahead and insert my needle knitwise, make sure you're gathering up the right strands here, and then continue knitting. So no change to the stitch pattern here, we're just knitting, but we've got our new color. So when you get to the point where you're ready to cast off, you'll simply turn your work, set yourself up as if you're knitting another row, and then we're going to knit the first 2 stitches. Then we'll take the first stitch that we knit and pass it over that second one. So just use your other needle to slide it under there, and you'll probably need to pull up just a little bit. And I like to hold this on my other needle here with my index finger as I slide it over, just like that. Then we can knit the next stitch and repeat. So we knit one, we pass it over once we get that initial setup. Knit another one, pass it over. We'll do that until we get to the end of the row. Then when you make it to your last stitch, you'll go ahead and knit it. And then pass that stitch over until you have just that one loop remaining on your needle. Then we can go ahead and trim a tail. Once again, leave it about 8 inches or so. Then just pull up on that loop. What I like to do is pull that tail through the loop, make sure things are nice and secure, and it sort of fixes that little corner that tends to get a little messy. So the type of darning needle I like to use when I'm weaving in my ends, especially for knitting, is the bent tip. You can see how that tip is bent just a little bit. That really helps me to weave it in. If you don't have one of those, it's not a big deal. You can still do this technique without it. So I want to isolate sort of like the bump of the stitch. So I'm kind of going in and always going in the same direction. Now you can skip up a row if you want, or if you can grab both of them, that works too. Sometimes I find it easier to skip, and by skip I mean jump from this one to this one rather than go this one to this one. It really doesn't matter all that much, I've found. And you'll work it so you've got a few stitches on your needle. Go ahead and pull that through. You don't want to pull too tight because, as you can see, that will tuck in that little piece of the side there basically. So we don't want that to happen. And then what I'll do is I'll jump to the next ridge, catch my yarn under there, and then just sort of work that same technique down. And then we can trim that off. So you'll have to do that for all of your remaining ends. And that's all there is to it.
Now, once again, you can view the pattern completely for free over on my website. I'll have that linked in the description, the pinned comment, all of that stuff. But if you want to support the channel, I do have a PDF option as well if you prefer to have a copy to print or save to your device. I'll have that linked in the description as well. B.Hooked.com is our shop, and it's a great way to support this channel. We have PDF patterns, some pattern bundles, and some t-shirts. I appreciate all the support there. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next one.